All right, world history classes. We have the final section of chapter 15. I'm going to go ahead and share what you need to be printing off in my school center page. Remember, go to assignments and handouts, history of the Western world, the little plus sign next to it. Click on that, go to chapter 15, and it'll be the file that's titled Aggressors, Invade Nations, just like here on the PowerPoint slide. So let's cover this real quick. First of all, the section starts with the Empire of Japan. And last time we saw Japan, they had done their little modernization miracle, the Meiji Restoration, and they were kind of cruising along as a democracy heading into World War I. Well, after World War I, democracy got a little bit more hard-assish, I guess would be a word for it. And finally, the military, by the end of the 20s, had just pretty much taken over. You know, the prime minister had little control over them, and basically the military was making government decisions by 1930. And for the military, the answer to all their political problems and their leadership problems for Japan was about expansion. If they were able to expand throughout Asia, life would be great. They needed more resources. They thought they needed more living space. And they were going to do that by being aggressive militarily. And they were going to get the citizens behind them by going back to the old ways, the samurai warrior type class system and that kind of thing. So Japan wasn't modernizing. It was keeping the same old government. It was just putting a new group in charge of it. So Japan's immediate goal was China, the biggest and most, well, it wasn't the most powerful nation in Asia anymore, but it had the most potential. So their new militaristic government target was Manchuria in 1931. They made up a little scenario, went in and invaded despite the government's protest. That's the Japanese government's protest. And they set up a puppet government. Brand new country called Manchukuo. They put the old emperor of China in charge of it, sort of. And boom, they had themselves a country that everybody was supposed to believe in, but nobody did. Only the Vatican and El Salvador recognized them as an official country. Then they invaded the rest of China in 1937, and that invasion, where they took over the eastern half of the country, kind of showed their aggressive, brutal style, the Japanese military. There's the rape of Nanjing. There's all sorts of kind of brutality and military atrocities committed by the Japanese. And this is really, all of this is before the start officially of World War II. So let's move on to the rest of the Axis. First of all, Italy. Now, of course, we'd mentioned in the other section, Italy didn't have much of a military to go along with its fascism. So they kind of go for places that they can handle. So in the colonial world, they go after the country of Ethiopia, a place, ironically, they weren't able to get in the late 1800s. But this time, Mussolini gets revenge while you get Ethiopia, kind of like beating a mid-major in the NCAAs. And Britain and France, who had colonies right next to Ethiopia, could have easily kind of slapped down Mussolini and not allowed him to do this. But they thought that might be too aggressive, might prompt a war in Europe. So this is the first sign that Britain and France show that they're going to do a policy of appeasement in Europe by going ahead and letting Italy take over Ethiopia, even though their king publicly asked for help. Hitler, during this period, 1935, begins to publicly ignore the Versailles Treaty, saying, oh yeah, we're supposed to have limits on our army. No, we'll have whatever we want. And then he takes that larger army and marches them into the Rhineland. You see the Rhineland in the picture there. That place was supposed to be devoid of any German troops, and the only troops allowed in there were going to be French troops. Hitler kicks them out, and of course the French leave obediently. So, with the Rhineland now occupied by the Germans, and Hitler publicly ignoring the Versailles Treaty and the Allies seemingly going along with it, Hitler's popularity at home is soaring. It's looking like he's finally a man that's standing up to the evil Allies who had stuck it to the Germans so bad after World War I. Now, in 1936, both Italy and Germany also signed what was called the Axis Agreement, agreeing to join forces with each other. Not so much publicly saying that they were going to go to war together, but that they were official allies. And Japan later joined this alliance later in the year. So it's the Axis Agreement, the name of that, that makes that side of World War II called the Axis powers. Now, one of the big events in the mid-30s, in 35 through 37, it's fought a couple more years after that. It's not really settled till 39. So like 35 to 39 is the Spanish Civil War. You had the fascist nationalists versus the democratic Republicans. The fascists are led by Francisco Franco, and he was backed with both Nazi and Italian support, troops, and leadership. The Republicans, meanwhile, were supported only by the Soviet Union. The British and the French glaringly stayed out. The United States had already declared itself kind of worldwide neutral. They considered themselves a larger Switzerland. So none of those folks officially would go help the Spanish Republicans. Now, there was quite a sizable mercenary group of people, Americans, British, French, that went over there and fought for the Spanish Republicans, but they didn't bring with them the money and the arms that these governments would have supplied. Hitler's Nazi forces kind of used this civil war as a training ground for a future European conflict, using the Luftwaffe or Air Force, kind of practicing out their blitzkrieg type strategy that they're going to use in World War II. Numerous atrocities at Spanish cities like Guernica, which there's a famous Picasso painting about, were committed by Nazi forces, and the army looked probably overly prepared for war, but even that still wouldn't draw in the Allied forces to help out the other side, or to kind of publicly rebuke or even aggressively go after Germany to keep them from building up in the future. So Hitler's plan of domination was to kind of just, pick off little areas that were either friendly to him or close. And he started out with, as you'll see in the picture, just south of Czechoslovakia and Germany is the German-speaking country of Austria, which was quite friendly to the Germans. And the Germans simply annexed them. And basically the Austrian people announced their support for this annexation. So it was easy for the West to kind of turn their heads and look the other way on the annexation of Austria and the elimination of the Austrian government. It's when Hitler kind of looked at the new nation of Czechoslovakia that people started getting concerned. As you'll see here in the brown or the tan little edges of Czechoslovakia, this was an area of the country called the Sudetenland. And in some areas, it actually had German-speaking majorities. And then in other areas, the German speakers were the largest minority in that region. This was a part of Czechoslovakia that the Germans kind of considered their own anyway. So Hitler moved troops into the Sudetenland to take it over and make it part of German territory. This action is what prompted the 1938 Munich conference that we'll talk about in the next slide, in which eventually he was allowed to keep the Sudetenland. 6 months after that, toward the very end of 38, beginning of 39, he took Czechoslovakia itself. And during this whole period, the British and the French, basically they kept drawing lines. Don't take Austria. Okay, you took Austria. Don't take the Sudetenland. Okay, he took the Sudetenland, but this time don't take Czechoslovakia. And then, of course, when he took that, the last straw was going to be Poland. Don't take Poland. So this whole thing of letting Hitler have whatever he wants, just for the very fact that he won't declare total war in Europe, this was called appeasement. And the British and the French were not only guilty of this, but the United States was as well. They considered themselves one of the more dominant countries of the world by this point, and yet they were totally staying out of European affairs, even though they knew that Nazi domination of Europe would not be good for their government. Like I said, we had the Munich Conference, which started in September 29th of 1938. And on the left there, shaking hands with Hitler, would be the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. And when Chamberlain and the French Premier went to visit Hitler, it turned into kind of a joke, and led by Chamberlain, who famously gave in to Hitler on the Sudetenland, only on the promise that Hitler would do no more damage in Europe. The translation, what Hitler heard was he could do whatever he wanted to and Europe would do nothing. And of course, Chamberlain went back to London and famously on the tarmac at Heathrow Airport held up the document and was like, "This is for peace in our time." And then, of course, 6 months later, Hitler promptly took the rest of Czechoslovakia, and the British and French let it happen. And just opening up Chamberlain to critics like Winston Churchill, who's going to take over as prime minister after Chamberlain is kind of shamed out of office, because folks like Churchill said, the only thing that's going to happen with this is going to be war, and a war that we might lose since we keep giving in to this guy time after time and let him get more powerful and get more support at home. So the Munich Conference for the Allies was a disaster, and it was a great deal for Hitler. Not only because he got whatever he wanted to, but because the Allies wouldn't include Russia or the Soviet Union on their side of the table, which is going to eventually drive Stalin over to the Nazi side. So, 1939, the first half of it, just right immediately before World War II, you have Britain and France trying to get the Soviets to join them. Like I said earlier, Stalin wasn't happy that he was left out of the Munich Conference, so he turns to Hitler and secretly negotiates with him and signs a non-aggression pact with Germany on August 23rd, 1939. They would share Poland. The Germans promised not to go to war with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union does likewise. And with that promise of a non-two-front war in place for Hitler, he would invade Poland 8 days later. And this is going to turn out, September 1st, 1939, to be what is the official start of World War II. Thanks, you guys, for listening. Make sure you print these notes off, and we will see you in class.